It was, that's good for you.
I'm not getting into this.
The other thing was to prevent the staffs from dividing up. So it's my staff, his staff, rather than our staff. And Carter was very, very helpful in this. Dick Moe became a key member of the Carter staff. Carter officials were on my staff, and we tried to blend the two. And all of that was very helpful.
Right. And as I recall, Mr. Vice President, President Carter volunteered two other things that really added to your credibility as Vice President. He told his staff and his cabinet, I want you to respond to the Vice President as if the request came from me. The other thing he said, and this was based on the unhappy experience of Vice Presidents like Humphrey and Rockefeller, there was a threatened White House staff, and he said, if I find any of you undercutting the Vice President, your tenure is going to be very limited here. And those messages were stronger than almost anything else in terms of establishing your credibility.
And there was one other I liked. In the spring of a new vice presidency, the reporters start writing this question: whatever happened to the vice president? And they're skilled and seasoned at it. And when that started in, Carter called them all personally and made the pitch for our strong relationship. And that was really a shock to the press corps to be briefed in that manner, but it really worked.
It did work.
Yeah.
It did work. Vice President Biden, how did you and President Obama build off of this experience? What can you tell us about the process of, because every new administration has to do this anew, depending upon your own skills and interests and so forth.
Well, the first thing I did for real is when the president asked me whether I would be vetted, I said, no, thank you. I don't want to be vice president. No, for real. I honest to God, thought I could help him more as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. And he said, I need to know right away. I said, well, no, I don't want to do this. I was on a train, actually. I spent 80% of my life on the train. And he said, how much time do you need? I said, I don't need any time. He said, go on home and talk it over with your family and get back to me. And my family was right and made the right decision. Best decision in my political career was to join the president. And the first person I called was Fritz. That's not hyperbole. The first person I called. And I said, tell me about what the modus vivendi you and President Carter worked out. And he went into some great detail. As a matter of fact, gave me a memorandum and laid out what he thought were the essential elements to make it work. You all know, and I think Fritz would agree, we've not talked about this, the vice presidency is totally a reflection of the president. There's no inherent power, none, zero. And it completely, thoroughly, totally depends on your relationship with the president. And I started off, Dick, with a great advantage. If you go back, and not anybody should, and the president and I debated 13 times in 2008, trying to get the nomination. And if you look back on it, the only two people who didn't disagree on a single substantive issue were the president and me. We disagreed in degree, but we never disagreed on a substantive issue. And so it started off where I knew that I was simpatico with the president-elect. And secondly, we had a genuine relationship. When he asked me, Fritz, why, I asked him why did he want me to be vice president? And he said two things in this order. He said, number one, I know you will always tell me the truth, that you'll be straight with me. You will not, there'll be no varnish on what you tell me. And he said, secondly, I need help in governing. And thirdly, your experience in foreign policy would be helpful. And then I called you again, as you remember, and Joan. And because Joan was a gigantic help to my wife Jill. Really extremely thoughtful, because that is another very difficult job. It's almost demeaning the title, being the second lady. Jill was new and young, and Joan was an enormous help. And what you both basically said was that it matters that you have a personal relationship. I don't mean that you party together or you go to the movies together or whatever. It's that you have a relationship that is built on a genuine personal affection. And the two things about your administration and ours, I can't recall a single word being written where Barack Obama and I have been leaking out of the White House, there's dissension in the White House, because we did what you suggested. I had an advantage. Most of the people we picked for example, right from the outset, Fritz, when I called you about picking the cabinet. And we spent 14 hours a day some days on the 80th floor or whatever it was in a high-rise office building in Chicago in that interregnum period putting together a cabinet. And the president at the outset said, you have veto right on anybody in this cabinet. If you think we should not move, and interestingly enough, he asked my opinion on every cabinet member, and we were in total agreement. And a number of the cabinet members I knew better than the president knew because I'd worked with them for a long time. And so what we did was we integrated staff from the beginning. Senator Kaufman, then my chief of staff, is here today with me. Ron Klain, who had been my chief of staff, was there, and a guy named Mark Gittenstein, who had run the Judiciary Committee for me. And the three of them sat with four of his people, and we made every single decision together. So I was pretty certain from the outset that this would be collegial. And so what happened was that from that point on, we had an added advantage. My grandchildren and his children are each other's best friends now. They vacation together. My daughter-in-law and Michelle are close. Jill is close. So it ended up being one of these things where it was, I warned the president, when he got me, he got the whole family. He thought I was kidding. There's a great picture I have in my office. I should have brought it if I had thought about it. The night in Grant Park, Fritz, when we got in the call from Cheney, we got in the call from, but he was very gracious, by the way, to me, that's another story. But we'd gotten the call saying that the opposition had conceded, and so we're in Grant Park, there were 1 million people, we're backstage, and my mom, who was 92 years old, who really liked Barack, liked the president, she's standing back with us, and they say, now, ladies and gentlemen, the next president of the United States, Barack Obama, and the next vice president, Joe Biden. And there's a picture of my mom reaching out and grabbing Barack's hand, and he's kind of looking at her funny in the picture, and she's saying, it's going to be okay, honey, come with me. And so my mother gets up and walks us both out on the stage. And Barack just looked like, okay, here we go. But the key has been that we have a great trust in one another, and our staffs are at least half of the president's staff were my former staff members, so but it rests on one thing: defining what it is you want to do, and determining whether or not the president-elect agrees with you. He asked me, do I have any conditions? What portfolio do I want? And because I talked to Fritz, I said, Mr. President, I don't want any portfolio. I can serve you best because I'm the only one of your quasi-cabinet members who can cross all lines. I can take care of cross-jurisdictional issues. But I don't want to, as my brother-in-law would say, I don't want to be put in a position where I'm cutting somebody else's grass. I don't want to be in a position where a cabinet member worries that I am taking any line authority from them. And so he said, well, what do you want? I said, two things. One, to be able to completely be level with you and argue with you if we disagree privately. And secondly, I want to be the last person in the room on every major decision. And I didn't mean it figuratively, I meant literally, to be the last person in the room. He's president, he gets to make the decision, and unless there's an overwhelming disagreement on principle, in which case I develop prostate cancer or something and leave, And he knew I meant that for a major fundamental disagreement. But there have been none. And I get to be the last person in the room, make my case to him privately. And that's where I think I could serve best. And I hope I have served best in that role. And that's what you did, Fritz, and that's what you advised me. And so that's how it developed, Dick. It was a long conversation, and he was open about it, and he made it clear. He said, I want to make clear that when I have a disagreement with you, I'm going to flat out tell you. And I want you to do the same with me and do it in private. And so we've had some very candid discussions like friends do, like you and Fritz did when you're in the Senate, like you and Fritz did as vice president, and probably where you argued a little bit. That's the healthy part of a relationship between a president and a vice president if it can be established.
So would you say, Shert, that you're basically an across-the-board advisor in the same sense that he was, and troubleshooter?
Yes, I do two things. Look, I spend between, depending on the season, 4 to 7 hours a day, every single day with the president. I attend every meeting the president has at his request. I did not ask to do that, but at his request. And I am the primary interlocutor because all of my years, like you, Fritz, served in the United States Senate and the House. If you notice, whenever there's as Amy's here, she can tell you, whenever there's a problem, I get sent to the Hill. Which, by the way, is a useful use of my time, because I really respect the members up there, and I still have a lot of Republican friends. I don't think my chief enemy is the Republican Party. This is a matter of making things work. And the president, the second thing he does, and he did with President Carter did with you, but government's even gotten bigger, Fritz, since you were vice president. The president also indicated that I would be given specific assignments. That, for example, when he did the Recovery Act, $800 billion had to be rationally spent in 18 months. And he said, Joe, you do it. And I never had to report to him, never had to question it. There was never a time that I had to check. I had complete authority.
So were these basically coordinating assignments, as in Iraq, the middle class?
Some were, almost all of them had cross-jurisdictional requirements.
Right.
For example, the Recovery Act, it involved the entire cabinet. And so I held, he authorized me to hold, I think I did 18 cabinet meetings. And I remember the first cabinet meeting, Fritz. One cabinet member said, I don't think that's such a good idea, Mr. Vice President. I said, well, look, why don't you do what I tell you or go talk to the president? But don't, go talk to him. It's okay. And that ended any discussion. No, but I really mean it. It really matters. I mean, it really matters when people know you are speaking for the president and you have his confidence. And like you in foreign policy, if you notice, I will get sent to go speak to Putin or go speak to Erdogan or go speak to whomever. And it's because the Secretary of State, we've had two great Secretaries of State, but when I go, they know that I am speaking for the president. There is nothing missed between the lip and the cup, that whatever I say, the president is saying. And so it's a great advantage for a president to be able to have that in someone, because the job is so big.
Right. Vice President Mondale, does this all sound familiar?
Yeah. One of the things that I told President Carter, I said, if I'm going to help you in these kinds of assignments, they've got to believe that they're talking to you, that we're partners, that I'm not just a visitor there. And so you've got a stake, I think we've got a stake in making that point. And it took a while, because this was a new institution, but I think we did. The other thing that you talked...
On that point, which you did, though, by the time it got to President Obama, he didn't even I didn't have to ask him that. He had already made that judgment, because you really did modernize the president, the vice presidency, and he studied it. The smartest, one of the brightest guys I've ever met in my life is Barack Obama. And he had studied it as well. And he would say to me, well, you know, the way it worked with Bowman, the way it worked, but I didn't have to convince the president of anything at all, anything at all. But he just assumed I would want an assignment like I'm sure you, President Carter might have thought with you, that like Al Gore did the environment. Well, you know, I didn't want a line assignment because of, but he learned from you, the president.
One of the things we had to work out earlier in our administration was, what do we do about differences? You mentioned how you and Obama deal with it. And what we agreed to do right up front was that I would not disagree with them publicly, you know, at a cabinet meeting or out on the trail. But if I really disagreed with them, I'd go in and have it out with him alone. And we did that, and then we'd go out together. I knew I wasn't the president, he was the president, and the object of this was to strengthen the president.
Well, you told me that, and it's really come in extremely handy. For example, when we were dealing with Osama bin Laden, for the president and I and only 2 others in the administration knew about Abbottabad as early as August. We did not go for almost a year to get him, and major players in the cabinet didn't know about it until January or February the following year. And so it was something that was a difficult call for the president. So we sat in the cabinet room, and at the end of the day, making the decision, he said, "Now I want everybody's opinion." And everybody went around the room, and there were only 2 people who were definitive and were absolutely certain. Leon Panetta said go, and Bob Gates, who's already publicly said this, said don't go. And others were as 59-41. Some ended up saying go, but it was such a close call. And I joked and I said, you all sound like 17 Larry Summers, an economist, on the one hand and the other hand. And he said, Joe, what would you do? And there was a third option that I didn't really think we should do. I said, well, I think we should make one more pass with another UAV to see if it is him. And the reason I did that is I didn't want to take a position to go if that was not where he was going to go. So as we walked out of the room and walked upstairs, I told him my opinion, that I thought he should go, but to follow his own instincts. But it would have been a mistake. Imagine if I had said in front of everyone, don't go or go, and his decision was a different decision. It undercuts that relationship. So I never, on a difficult issue, never say what I think finally until I go up in the Oval with him alone, because it's not a good thing with the relationship you had with President Carter and I have with the president to be in a position where we're at. And sometimes we do differ. Sometimes I go up and I say, Mr. President, I think you should turn right or go straight. And he said, no, I'm going left. He's the president. But that's the only way it works.
Let me ask you both this. Did you want to say something? It is your show, you know.
Well, good point. Good point. You talked about how you undertook these diplomatic missions for the president. And you were in a wonderful position to do it on our, because of your background in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, years you've been on the road traveling on those same trips. Well, I didn't have the foreign policy background you did. I had some.
You did.
I had some. And what I found worked, visiting the Chinese or the boat people or all those issues, is that they recognized me as being the president's guy and recognized me as knowing something about how our system works, and so that if we made an agreement, it would be a real agreement. And that helped a lot, I think, and I think the President Carter would agree with that.
I want to make it clear, Dick, that on all the major relationships, I will occasionally be sent to meet with the Chancellor of Germany or the Prime Minister of England or the President of France. But the advantage I had, and could save the President a lot of time, I have long personal relationships. I was there 36 years, and I personally met, like you, I met every major world leader in the last 40 years. And a number of them I have close personal relationships, dealing with them when they were in their legislative bodies. And so what it basically happens, Mr. Vice President, is I end up in a situation where, for example, I know all the Eastern European leaders very well, the Central European. So they are satisfied with talking to me, knowing I speak for the president. But the president does all the heavy lifting. The president is the guy who is the one I have a, give me an example, what President Carter did with you, but what President Obama did. When President Xi was vice president, he and President Hu at a state dinner decided that Xi and I should get to know one another. And it was President Obama's idea. And so I spent 5 days traveling, I don't know, 15, 20,000 miles inside of China with President Xi. He came here as my guest. I spent 4 of the 5 days. He was here, except when he went to Maquoketa, Iowa. I was afraid to think I was running if I went. And by the way, he did go there because he had, as a young man, been there. But as a consequence of that, I've had 20, 25 hours of private dinners with President Xi when he was vice president. So even in a relationship like that, the president manages it, but occasionally, if he doesn't have time, I can be sent. So it worked because of the nature of what I had done before.
And the other thing is the years that you spent in Congress. I didn't spend as many as you, but I spent many, many years in the Congress, so that when we had real issues, like we were trying to get the Panama Canal,
I remember.
it was a real fight, as you remember. And I was able to go up there and I think help make a difference because—
You did more than help.
Yeah.
You did more than help. You actually pushed that. You actually pushed it over. I remember you sitting with Wendell Ford, because everybody in the Senate and the House, for that matter, respected Fritz, and they knew that whatever he told them was straight stuff, and it mattered. And so I think you did more. And by the way, there's a similarity between President Carter and President Obama. President Obama only spent 4 years in the Senate.
Right.
He had great respect, has great respect and good relationships, but just like President Carter, he didn't know intimately a lot of these folks. And so personal relationships matter, and particularly back in the days when we treated each other with more respect. By the way, the difference is, the best lesson I ever learned was from Senator, our majority leader, Mike Mansfield from Montana. I used to have to go see him once a week when I got there, when you and Joan were helping me get through what happened when I first got elected. And I didn't realize it, he'd give me an assignment once a week. I thought every freshman got an assignment. I did. I was 29, and turned out he was just basically taking my pulse because I said I wasn't going to come to the Senate, as you remember. You're one of the ones that said talk. Anyway, the bottom line is, I walked on the floor one day, and Jesse Helms was excoriating Bob Dole and Ted Kennedy on the predecessor legislation for the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I had to go into my meeting with the majority leader. I sat down, Dick, and I guess I looked perturbed. He said, "What's the matter?" And I railed against Jesse Helms, and he had no social redeeming value. He didn't care about handicapped. And he let me go on. And he looked at me. It was the most important lesson I learned. He looked at me, and I mean this sincerely. He said, "Joe, what would you say if I told you Jesse and Dot Helms 3 years ago adopted a young man in braces on both legs up to his hips who was 14 years old as their own?" I'd say, "I'd feel like a jerk." He said, "Well, he did." And he said, "Joe, what I've learned is," and this is your MO, he said, "it's always appropriate to challenge another man or woman's judgment. It's never, never appropriate to assume a motive because you don't know." And today, I suspect that Amy will tell you, it's all about motive up there. It's not about judgment. You're a bad person. You really are not a good, God-fearing man. You are. It's all about, it's about what people think your motive is and ascribe a motive. And it's often you can't get to yes. You can't get to yes after I tell you, I think you're dishonest or you're in the pocket of the industry. Then it's awful hard for us to get to yes. That's what's
If
wrong.
I can ask you both a question. You were both new to the vice presidency after years in the Senate. This is a new experience, and you had to make it up as you went. What was the greatest challenge you faced early in your vice presidency to make it work?
He did a lot better. I'd never in my entire life had a boss. I mean, for real. Even when I was a young lawyer, getting out of school, sitting in a law firm, and it was, I had to realize that anything I said would be attributed to the president. And so you had to, when asked a question, you had to refrain from answering or modulate your answer or make sure it was in line with the president's. And it took me a lot longer than it took you, Fritz. But it took about 6 months. And there wasn't anything nefarious about it. It was just you get asked your opinion as a senator my whole life. It was say, well, this is what I think. Well, that's not appropriate. You have to demur and work out what the administration position is. And
no, I had a tough time too. The campaign getting elected was just fine, but then when I actually sat down and realized I was giving up an independent position in the Senate, where I was in pretty good shape at home and I could do what I wanted. I was my own advisor. And suddenly it dawned on me when I got down to Plains that had changed a lot. and that now I had to check in with others. I had to check in with the president. We had to, it was several weeks before I felt comfortable. And I used to shuttle new cabinet officers down to Plains on what became Air Force Two. And a couple times I thought I'd just stay back home on that plane and forget it. But no, it was hard.
But even before that, in the spring, when you were just considering this idea, you sat down with Hubert Humphrey.
Yeah.
And for all of his unhappy experiences, you said, what about it? I love the Senate. I love my independence here. Why do I want to do this? What did he say to you? And
I told Carter what you told him. I'd just soon stay in the Senate. I can help you more there. But yeah, I met with Humphrey. Humphrey reputedly had a really tough time with Lyndon Johnson. Not reputedly, but really. And I knew it. We all knew that it was tough. And so I went to see him, and I said, you had this miserable time as vice president. You were on a roll in the Senate. You were maybe the most respected member of the Senate. You just come off several victories like the Civil Rights Act. And suddenly this thing all came to a crashing halt. I said, what do you recommend for me? And he said, I'd take it. He said, I think you'd like it. He said, I think it'd broaden you. I think you could do more in one day as vice president than you do all week or all year as a senator, and you'll grow and learn.
That was the day you opened your mind to the idea.
Right, because I wasn't going to do it. Then I got to thinking about it, yeah.
Thank you, Hubert.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. He was a good speaker.
He was one of the good speakers. He was, as you know, he was my mentor. He's the guy that got me to run for the Senate in the first place, and he was I really missed him.
You're speaking to a lot of his friends here today.
No, he was. And by the way, his heart was as big as his head, but he had a prodigious mind. He had a prodigious mind. And he used to come over when I first got there, Fritz, to console me, about losing my wife and daughter, how I was doing. And he'd end up on my couch, and he'd be crying. I'd be consoling him. No, I mean, for real. I was like, I said, no, it's okay, boss. It's all right. I'm fine, I'm fine. But what a wonderful, wonderful man.
Yeah. Vice President Biden, did you talk to your immediate predecessor about this?
I did. No, I didn't talk to him about the job. Look.
No, but about how the vice presidency worked?
No, what I talked to about him, look, first of all, I actually like Dick Cheney for real. I get on with him. I think he's a decent man. When I went to see him, I didn't talk to him before. I went to see him after we were elected. and I went to see him at the residence, and he and his wife were extremely gracious to Jill and to me. And he talked about how the office worked as related to the functioning of the office. But he had a very different relationship, and he was a powerful vice president. He had a very different relationship with President Bush. And one of the things I learned from, and it probably sounds like I'm making this up when I say I learned from, but I spoke to this man repeatedly about this job. And Vice President Cheney, he had his own national security team. And it was real, and they were smart guys and women. And I remember when I had recommended to the president Jim Jones, who I knew, and the president knew, I knew him a little better, as our first national security advisor. And I'll never forget sitting down with Jim. And what Jim was worried about, with good reason, I could have kept a staff of close to 22 folks. It was essentially a shadow national security council. And I said, and I remember the look on his face, and I said, Dick, look, I'm not going to keep that staff at all. I said, on one condition, and you should talk to the president about this. I have total access to the National Security Council. I can task them too, through you. I can bring them on, and we can do this jointly. You're the National Security Advisor, but the entire team you have will not be overshadowed. I will keep 3 people in my office. And I remember him going, oh my God, thank God. But because what it was is about the confidence I had in the president meaning what he said, and the president's confidence that I was not about to try to set up a satellite operation where I was going to take over line control of any department. And the guy who became the number 2 guy was one of my guys, you know, Tom Donlin, the people who were there. So it all worked, but I'll never forget the Cheney, I think, I don't know. The Cheney-Bush relationship at the outset was, it seemed to me to be more codependent. So Cheney had a very different view of the vice presidency in terms of how it functioned internally. But he was extremely helpful and gracious about the office and the legal parameters of the office and everything from the aircraft to the housing, et cetera.
Vice President Mondale, do you have some views on the Cheney vice presidency?
A little bit different, I would say. He was kind to me. He was kind to Joan. We visited the home and so on. But he said early on that he was going to take things to the dark side. And I believe he really did. And he created the vice presidency as sort of a privileged sanctuary. He wouldn't respond to subpoenas, stiffed the Congress on who his...
He had a different view.
Yeah. And he worked with some of his key guys to bring about the torture memo and so on. I think those were bad days in the history of the vice president. I know all the things you said are right, but I have a kind of
I don't disagree with that.
Harsh view of the man.
I have a harsh view of how the vice presidency, the office, was used. And so that's why he knew, because I was in the Senate during this period, he knew my strong disagreement. And to remember, he was talked about being totally independent. He was not executive. He was not legislative.
Right.
He was I don't know what he was.
He was everything.
But I think, again, look, that could not have happened without President Bush permitting it to happen.
That's right.
So that's when I said it was a very different relationship. I think at the end of it, it appeared, I don't know, it appeared that President Bush, that he had lost President Bush's confidence at the end because of a lot of things, I guess. But in terms of the actual transition, he was extremely gracious. But I've done nothing there's no similarity between the officers. There's a cartoon I was given, and I don't know who gave it to me. There's I think it's in the New Yorker, and Cheney's walking down what was allegedly the basement of the vice president's residence, and there's hand manacles on the wall, and there's chains, and I'm standing behind him. He said, "Joe, you might want to make a few decorating changes."
I'm told the manacles are gone. Right. Mr. Biden, you said a few minutes ago that you talked about your adjustment to coming to the vice presidency with your own agenda and adjusting to the president's agenda. There's really only one agenda in a White House. It's the president's agenda. And it just can't exist. I mean, it can't function with more than one agenda, right? And the criticism of the Cheney vice presidency is that there was a competing agenda at times. Isn't that basically what you were saying?
That's certainly what I thought was the case.
Well, again, I don't know inside. It ended up being a competing agenda, but at the outset it looked like it was an agenda written by Cheney that the president was agreeing to. Again, I simply don't know. The great advantage that I had, I said at the outset, is that President Obama and I have ideologically had no disagreement. None. I mean, zero. We've had tactical disagreements on how to implement. We've had disagreements on elements of our foreign policy, which have been made known. We've had disagreements on whether to be more or less assertive. But I didn't have the problem. And that's what made it comfortable from the beginning. Like I said, we served in the same committee together the short time he was in the Senate. I had spent a lot of time talking to him about his views on a whole range of issues, particularly on the middle class. And so I was confident, and it's borne fruit. I was confident that we had the same attitude about foreign policy and the use of force. We had the same attitude about everything from the tax structure to civil rights and civil liberties. You know, people make a big deal of the fact that I came out when asked about gay marriage. The other thing I told the president was that he asked, do you have anything you won't do? And I said two things. I won't wear any funny hats, and I'm not changing my brand. And so he knew what he was getting, and I knew what I was getting. There was no pretense about any of it, because he was not fawning over making sure I had the job, and I wasn't coveting the job. So it worked, and the main reason it's worked is to this day we are simpatico and on all the major issues. We'll have disagreements in degree, but so it was much easier for me.
Well, having studied,
and he knows what he thinks.
Having studied this office for a while, I have nothing but admiration for what you and President Obama have done to make this office work. It's not an easy office, but you've made it work really well.
See, I think that the Obama-Biden administration is solidifying the concept of the merged presidential, vice presidential institutions. When I started, that was in doubt. I mean, would we continue the old system of the separate, or would we try to executivize, as we called it, the vice president? We tried that, it's worked, and now here we're almost, 40 years later, and it's working better than ever.
Let me ask you both a follow-up question. Do you think this change that you both represent is permanent? There's nothing in the law, there's nothing in the Constitution, but by practice, is it permanent?
I think it has the prospect of, it's more likely to be permanent than not. And I say that for this reason. What's happened since in 40 years, Fritz, is the breadth and scope of the office has increased significantly. For example, he kidded me once and said, look, make up your mind. Do you want, before I was decided, whether you want to be Secretary of State or Vice President? And I joked with my wife about it, and she said, I know you'd rather be Secretary of State, but it'd be better for the family if you were Vice President. I'm thinking, okay. But he didn't offer me Secretary of State. The point of that was the context. He wanted me about doing foreign policy. But I have, as Vice President, I have traveled now over 1 million, almost 100,000 miles in 7 years. Again, that is because of the nature of not my consequence or importance, but the nature of how the job has gotten so immense. And ironically, it's occurred even more in foreign policy as a consequence of a unipolar world. And so even if a president didn't want a vice president to be doing a great deal more, it would have to be delegated more authority to a Secretary of State or a Secretary of Defense, because there's just not enough time literally to return the phone calls. There's not enough time. A president can't do that today.
Right. Vice President Mondale, do you think it's permanent?
I think it is likely to be permanent. I don't think you can be sure yet. As you pointed out, this is all personal to the president. We might get a president who doesn't want this. That's it. Or we might get a president and vice president that are a bad match. Can't do what you did with Obama or what I did with Carter, and therefore it's just irritations all along. But I think what we've seen over these last years, and particularly under your administration, is this is so spectacularly, obviously, the best thing to do to strengthen a president and make a presidency succeed, that I think the next president would be a damn fool not to try to do something like this.
Or at a minimum, the next president won't have to fight through the fact that it's not unusual for a vice president to pick up the phone and call a cabinet member and ask a question and request personnel. Or, I mean, that used to be, before you, a gigantic. I mean, if you read Caro's book about Johnson when he was vice president with President Kennedy, I mean, allegedly he never was invited in the Oval Office. He was, so. I think those days are gone, no matter what the relationship. But whether, again, as you said, you told me in the first place, Fritz, it depends on the personal chemistry between the president and vice president more than anything else to make it work.
What both of you have shown, I think, through your experience in this office, is that it is an enormous asset to the president to have a credible vice president doing the kinds of things you were just talking about.
As long as, remember, he or she is president.
Yes, exactly. Only one of them, right. Yeah. What would be your advice to a future vice president?
My advice would be just to make sure before you accept the office, there's clear understanding of what the president expects of you. I think the only thing that the only time there's real trouble is when there are different expectations of what you think you're going to be able to do or you want to do, or what's expected of you that you don't want to do. And so last point, I know we're running out of time. The president knows if there's something I disagree with him on privately, I'm not asked to try to sell it. The president, I never would disagree with the president. I will support it. But everybody knows that the bad news about me is no one doubts I mean what I say. Sometimes I say all that I mean. And so it doesn't work. It doesn't work to try to sell something you're not. Right. So it is important for the president to understand, and there to be clear understanding of what is expected.
Vice President Mondale, what would be your advice to a future vice president?
Look at this experience that Biden and the rest of us had. Come to a clear understanding of what a vice presidency involves. You can do that now. When I started, it wasn't clear where it was going to go. But now it's pretty clear what is possible. Ask yourself if you want to live that kind of life, and ask yourself whether the president would be comfortable with it. If the answers to those are no, don't do it. If they are.
Any final words, Mr. Vice President?
Most important thing for a vice president to be able to conclude is that that vice president, regardless of what is his or her responsibilities, They genuinely respect the president. It's hard to serve in this office if you don't genuinely respect the judgment and character of the man or the woman you're working with.
Final words, Mr. Vice
Yeah,
President?
one other thing I think is important in the transition. Many presidents looked on the vice president as a sort of suggestion of their tenuous place on earth. That, and that's a kind of a poisonous concept when you think about it. And it takes a president to take a deep breath and say, yes, I need this help. Yes, I'm not afraid of having somebody in that position. Yes, I want that person to be ready if that's what happens. Carter did that, and he talked about it, and he thought it through, and it made all the difference in the world in our relationship.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
Good job. Good job. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Mr.
I'll see you at the reception and at dinner.
Yes,
Good to
indeed.
see you be in your place, sir.
All right.
Take up all your day.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll keep this.
Hey, Stu, how are you? Good to see you, buddy. Oh, no, thanks for the